a little something? Ray Richards.
Bravo.
Let's stick that on you, right there.
You gonna let them sit down and get comfortable?
Yeah, they're all warm up.
Stop me at about 7 minutes. That'd be enough.
7 minutes, you got it.
Let's see, if you would, yeah, everybody be on this side so my voice will carry maybe a little bit. Good morning, everybody. It's good to be here. Good to see you. And I will tell you what, I'm impressed since yesterday. I have seen more friendship, love, mutual respect than I have in a long time. And it's really a pleasure and an honor for me to be here to be able to speak to you. I will also like to say I've not seen this much talent on the mat at one time, except in a place maybe like the Kodokan or the Case Joe or some of those places, those of you that know what I'm talking about.
Wow.
I'm going to talk about, I had two primary senseis as a young man. One was a fellow named Lester Kimball in the Air Force, and after he retired at a Shodan, and then he retired from judo. My second and favorite instructor, name's up on that wall there, Mr. Geis, Carl Geis. And I will tell you, in the early days in the Air Force, we were all in the Air Force together. Carl got out of the Air Force in 1958, and he came to Houston, and he started teaching judo at the YMCA at 1600 Louisiana in downtown Houston. And he taught judo. He had about 4, maybe 5 different locations in the Houston area. And he taught judo at least 50 years, count forward from 1958 until he passed away whenever he quit teaching then. We had 4 or 5 different locations. Probably in the time that he taught judo, he had, I'm going to, somewhere between, Bob help me out, 4,000, 5,000.
5,000, kind of about what I figured.
5,000 students sound about right. And then when you take the expansion of that, many of his early students went on to become teachers elsewhere. Please forgive my hands there, it's happens to you.
Sure.
But all over South Texas, South United States, Southern United States, you will see his influence if you understand his groundwork system, or maybe his foot sweep, or maybe his Osoto Gari. You will see those things replicated quite often. In the early days, in the Air Force, we called him Dutch, D-U-T-C-H, because of his ancestry background. Later on, when he got out of the Air Force and he became a full-time teacher, we called him the Renaissance man. Renaissance was a time period in history when people questioned what they were doing. They questioned the laws of nature, they questioned things. And Carl, of course, had been to Japan several times, and he started questioning, why does this work? Why does this technique work? Why does this one not work? And the traditional answer that we used to get from some of the Japanese instructors was simply, more pull, that makes it work. More pull, that was, you know, seriously, more pull. So, of course, it was proper position, but they had more pull. That was a common answer. And Carl Geis and George Harris and a guy named Bill Edwards, and those guys, they began to sit down and diagram out. You have to remember, we didn't have CDs. Anybody here know what a flip book is? The old picture books, you had 50 pictures put together and you'd flip them like that and you would see emotion in action. Well, that was the primary method of visual instruction if you were not on the mat. So they started diagramming judo techniques and trying to figure out where's the entrance position, where's the off balance, where does the throw take place, and how do you make the guy land. And one of the things that we soon discovered was Japanese sometimes drove you through the mat. Boom. Your body was still accelerating at the time that you hit, at the time that you landed. That was keep accelerating right up to the moment of impact. Later on, it began to be, because we're all training, sort of help the guy land a little bit. Let's relieve the pressure, pull up a little bit, see, cut down on injuries. But from there, Mr. Geist's influence spread around, and I don't think there's too many places in a lot of states that you can't go that either he didn't visit at some point in his career, or his students are now functioning, or students of his students, and in some cases, students of his students of his students, you see. And for instance, he was my second instructor. John over here was, how old were you, John, at that time?
13.
13, you see, when he was coming to my dojo. Can I tell him the story about the Japanese?
Sure.
We were attempting to learn Japanese because we knew someday, you know, some of these young fellows would want to go to Japan. And in those days, I had a little bitty phonograph, kind with a needle on it. You put it on the record and let it spin around. Yeah. And I had a 33 RPM Japanese course, lesson 1 through 20 or something.
I have that upstairs.
You still have it, huh? 33 RPM. And at the beginning of the workout, when the kids were warming up, we'd start the record. And it would play, and when it quit playing, we'd go over and start it again. So what do you call that? Subliminal learning, you see.
Japanese language.
Yeah. And some of these guys actually know Japanese words. When they hear it, they say, where did I learn that from, you see? Yeah. So that was the early days. Crude as it was, it helped produce, and most of you are descendants, first, second, third, fourth, Mr. Geist or some other great instructor. And I personally owe a debt, and those of you that were at, some of you were at Mr. Geist's memorial. I have a good friend named Lewis Wood. When Lewis first showed up, he was a real timid guy. Carl asked him, what's your name? He said Lewis, and Carl heard Bruce. So for the next 5 years, we called the guy Bruce. And one day he finally corrected Carl Geist, and you got to understand, in that day and time, it was not easy. Not easy to correct Carl Geist, I will tell you, you see. But Bruce made a statement at Carl's memorial, and it rings true to me and maybe to some of you, but Bruce made the statement that none of us would have known each other if it had not have been for Carl. We would not have known each other. And therefore, our lives would not have been as rich as it has been. And most of my friends are because I knew him. As a matter of fact, I owned 2 houses. When his little short career in real estate, I bought 2 houses from him. And he gave me a break on the commission, so that was okay. But because of him, I have been able to travel to I don't know how many countries in the world, either as a judo participant or as an observer, or just because I heard it was a good place to go. But that's the influence that he had on my life. And I have 2 sons, and they both took judo for a while, and my grandson now, he's now taking karate, and I keep trying to move him over toward judo, but he likes karate. So we knew Carl as the Renaissance man, and when he came back from Japan, I think he made 4th degree in Japan one time when he came back. He was one of the few, I'm going to call them round eyes, non-Japanese, non-Oriental people that they promoted to 4th degree in the Kodokan. And when he came back, he had 2-3 notebooks full of notes. Because what he was doing, he would be going to class in the morning and work out in the afternoon or vice versa. And he'd go home at night and scribble, trying to remember what he did. And when he came back, we're all sitting around in a circle trying to read his scribbles. What does this mean? What does that mean? And someplace in his former dojo or in his effects, I'm sure that those notebooks are still safely wrapped together somewhere. And we're still waiting for some of those techniques to be translated so we can understand them, because he had some great instructors. Carl was probably I'm going to call him a father figure for many people. In the early days, he had little kids, and this was a time of women's lib. Women were going into the job markets. Little children would go to school and come to the dojo after school. They would be babysitting at the dojo. And at one time, we even had two ladies that used to go around to the to the elementary schools and pick up the little kids and bring them in. Now it's a pretty common thing, I think, to have shuttle service for some of the kids. But some of those little kids, that was their afternoon activity, was judo. And he was very conscientious. He would make some of them who had homework, they would bring their homework. They would do their homework on the mat. Some of them would take a nap on the mat, and then they would do judo for 30 minutes, 40 minutes, an hour, and their mom or dad would pick them up. So he's kind of a latchkey kid, if you understand that concept, the latchkey kid. So his influence you see around you today, but you cannot count the number of people who learned a lot from him. We learned the psychology of judo. We learned lots of human nature. Carl had a temper, some of you know that. And we learned how to manipulate, how to avoid. Remember Aikido, avoid, get out of the way? Okay. We learned how to do some of that. And I will tell you, in later years, when you get grown, it's good to know how to react to some people. So in my opinion, he was one of probably the 4 or 5 early great instructors in the United States in the field of judo. Not only the technical expertise, but the breadth of what he taught, the width of what he taught, the various subjects of what he taught. There was nothing that he would not explore if you brought it up to him. I mean, he would do the research on it. So that's my impression, that's my memory of Carl Geis. Anybody know what his middle name was?
Edwin.
Okay, I just want to make sure. Carl was born in 1933, and when did he die? Last year? That'd be 2014, wasn't it? So he started teaching judo as a young man out of the Air Force, and that was not only his career, it was his avocation. That was his life. He was a teacher, sometimes a preacher of judo, but that was his avocation. Does anyone have any questions before I relinquish the floor? I think my 8 minutes are about up.
You might tell about how he got the organization started in Philadelphia for the U.S.
Carl was one of the original founders of the USJA. Let me back up. In those days, we had one organization that we promoted through, or he promoted through. It was Udanjikai, located in Denver, Colorado. And if he wrote up a promotion and sent it in, we might not hear anything back for a year, without exaggeration, without a year. And one of the things that happened was Carl and a bunch of other Air Force people took the Armed Forces Judo Association and moved it over into the civilian world by changing the name and changing its means of incorporation. And it started out the USJA, and it still functions today in one manner or another. But he was one of the very earliest, and you have to understand that for a while we were persona non grata. That means we were not welcome places, because we were what? Challenging judo authority in the United States.
Judo Black Belt.
Judo Black Belt Federation, yeah, we were challenging authority. And in some cases, you would go to a tournament, you'd have a guy that was maybe a Sandan, maybe from Korea, maybe from Japan, and the American associations would not let them wear their colored belt. And I'll tell you one story. Am I past my 8 minutes, Sensei?
No.
Okay, good. We had one fellow who had competed in the Philippines and competed in South Korea. And he came to, I think it was the Texas Championships that year, and he was one of Carl's students. And when he signed in, he didn't belong to the correct organization, so they told him he had to wear a white belt. So he had on black. He was about Sandan in those days. He walked to the edge of the mat, took off his black belt, folded it neatly, placed it on the mat, put on a white belt, bowed in, stepped up. How'd you make? The match only lasted about 9 or 10 seconds because he threw that poor guy, who really was not a part of it. He just happened to be the opponent. He threw that poor guy.
Gary, would it?
Sir?
Wouldn't have to be Soto.
Oh, Soto Gary. Yeah, he catch you one way, old Soto, foot sweep the next way, you know, you see, yeah. But that poor guy never really knew what hit him. And that was some of the things that used to happen, you see. And Bob Ray in the back, he was around in some of those things. I think, John, you remember some of those. I'm looking around. But that was the early days of judo in this country, in the South anyway. And I would like to say that judo has had a great civilizing effect on many of us. But most of us just like to fight. We didn't care, just fight, you know. And I'm not going to mention any names, but we had one or two guys that would go downtown and just bump into people. What'd you say to me? You know, and sort of start it, you know. And Carl tried to train that out of some of those guys. He said, because you never know who you're going to meet on the street, you know. That was the days before we had concealed weapon carry licenses. So most people were barehanded. But he tried to train that out. And probably some of us would have been in jail, without exception, if it hadn't been for some of his civilizing effect. And I want to tell you something. If you ever have him get on your case and really tell you off, he had that ability. But it was a love-hate relationship. You either loved the man or you hated the man, and sometimes you just weren't sure, you know. So for a lot of those guys in those years, he became a father figure. And even today, some of them are, I'm going to use the term grieving, because he died at, I'm going to call a relatively young age, you see. And I understand that, you know, nature does that to us. But anyway, you guys have a great legacy. You have a great place to train, and I'm impressed with the natural sunlight and that sort of thing. And I appreciate the hospitality. And if there's no more questions, I'd like to bow off now. Thank you a lot.
I got one thing to say about Carl that's noteworthy. One time
Let me put this mic on you, sir. Thank you. Thank you.
well, it's a short.